The palace corridor went
my
silent the moment a child's
God.
voice cracked through it. "You're not my mother." Prince Louis, normally all smiles and mischief, stood frozen, defiant, as Camilla's sharp words echoed behind him. And the royal guard watched everything. What really happened in that private hallway? Why did one of the most protected children in Britain reach a breaking point? And how did a single guard's decision quietly change the balance inside the royal family? This is not a fairy tale. This is a royal moment few were meant to hear. If stories that pull back the curtain on royal life fascinate you, you're in the right place. Tap like if you enjoy emotional, behind-the-scenes royal stories. Subscribe for weekly deep dives you won't hear anywhere else. And share this video with someone who loves the royal family as much as you do. Now, let's step inside the palace. Palaces are never truly silent. Even in their quietest hours, there's always something: soft footsteps on polished stone, the low murmur of staff behind closed doors, the faint rustle of curtains stirred by a draft that's traveled centuries to get there. But that afternoon, in one narrow corridor tucked away from cameras and ceremony, something happened that cut through every sound like glass breaking. A child's voice, sharp, hurt, unmistakably angry. "You're not my mother." The words didn't echo loudly. They didn't need to. They landed heavy, hanging in the air longer than they should have. And for one royal guard standing just a few steps away, time seemed to pause. This was not supposed to happen. Prince Louis of Cambridge, young, energetic, famously cheeky, was not known for defiance. To the public, he was the boy who pulled faces on palace balconies, who tugged at his older brother's uniform buttons, who made even the stiffest royal moments feel human. But this was different. This was not playful. This was raw. The guard knew it instantly. He had been stationed there for routine coverage. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensitive, or so he'd been told. Just another internal movement inside the palace, another day of quiet vigilance. But then he heard shouting. Not loud enough to alert the entire wing, but sharp enough to set off every instinct drilled into him over years of service. Raised voices were rare in royal corridors. Raised voices involving children? Almost unheard of. The guard shifted his stance slightly, careful not to draw attention, but alert enough to intervene if needed. He couldn't see everything. Palace corners are designed that way, but he could see enough. Prince Louis stood rigid, small hands clenched at his sides. His face was flushed, eyes wide not with fear, but with something far more complicated. Confusion, anger, the kind of emotional overload adults forget children can feel just as deeply. And opposite him stood Queen Camilla. Her posture was upright, controlled, but her expression told another story. There was frustration there, impatience, the kind that slips out when someone believes they are speaking privately, shielded by status and walls. The guard didn't hear every word Camilla said before the outburst, but he heard enough to know this was not a gentle exchange. Her tone had risen, not a scream, but a sharp reprimand. The kind that makes a child feel small. Too small. That's when Louis snapped. "You're not my mother." The words came out louder than he likely intended. And the moment they did, everything changed. For a fraction of a second, Camilla looked stunned. Not angry, surprised, as if she hadn't expected resistance. As if the line between authority and affection had just been crossed, and crossed back. Children say honest things, sometimes painfully honest things. And in that moment, Prince Louis wasn't speaking as a royal. He wasn't speaking as a future statesman's son. He was speaking as a child who knew exactly who his mother was and who she was not. The guard felt his jaw tighten. Protocol raced through his mind. Do not interfere. Do not listen. Do not react. Guards are trained to be invisible. They see everything and acknowledge nothing. But there are exceptions, unwritten ones. Especially when a child is involved. Especially when something feels wrong. Camilla responded quickly, her voice dropping, controlled again. The guard couldn't make out the words now, but he could hear the tone shift. Firmer, colder, as if trying to regain control of a moment that had slipped through her fingers. Prince Louis didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, shoulders tense, breathing uneven. For a child so often seen laughing in public, this silence was jarring. Where were Prince William and Kate? That question hit the guard almost immediately. Children of Louis's age were rarely without a parent, or at least a trusted aide nearby. And yet, here he was, cornered in a corridor, facing a situation far bigger than him.
The guard took a subtle step forward, not enough to intrude, just enough to be noticed if needed. That's when Louis's eyes flicked toward him. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. The sudden realization that someone else had heard, someone else had seen, and strangely, that seemed to steady him. Camilla noticed a shift too. Her gaze followed Louis's, landing on the guard. For a brief moment, the corridor held 3 people, and a tension so thick it felt physical. Royal hierarchy is powerful. Everyone in that palace knew it, but so is instinct, and the guard's instincts were screaming. Children must feel safe. This was not safety. Camilla straightened, her expression smoothing into something more neutral. Royal composure snapped back into place like a practice mask. She said something quietly to Louis, something meant to end exchange. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking softly, disappearing around the corner as if nothing had happened, as if the air hadn't just cracked. Prince Louis didn't move. The guard hesitated. He was not supposed to speak, not supposed to comfort, not supposed to acknowledge. But rules are written for normal days, and this no longer felt like one. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked gently. It was a simple question. Respectful, measured. Louis nodded, though it was clear he wasn't fine. Not really. Children rarely are after moments like that. But he squared his shoulders the way he'd seen his father do, the way his brother was already learning. "I want my mum," Louis said quietly. That was all. The guard radioed discreetly, requesting a senior aide. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. Just a child needing his parent. Within minutes, footsteps approached, familiar ones. A trusted presence. The kind the palace relied on when emotions spilled beyond schedule. As Louis was gently guided away, the guard remained in place. Still, silent, but inside, something had shifted. He knew what he'd heard. He knew what he'd seen. And he knew that moments like this didn't just disappear, not in families, and certainly not in royal ones. This was more than a child talking back. This was a boundary being drawn. And somewhere else in the palace, Prince William and Kate were about to learn that something had gone very, very wrong. And the guard who witnessed it all would soon face a choice that could define his entire career. By the time Prince Louis was led away from the corridor, the sharpest edge of the moment had passed, but the weight of it hadn't. Children don't process emotions the way adults do. They don't file them away neatly or soften them with logic. They feel them fully, all at once, like a sudden storm with no warning. Louis walked quietly beside the aide, his small hand brushing the wall as they moved. He wasn't crying. That almost made it worse. People often mistake silence in children for calm. In reality, it's often a sign that something inside is struggling to make sense of itself. For Prince Louis, that struggle had been building for a long time. Life inside the royal family looks dazzling from the outside. Balconies, carriages, uniforms, smiling crowds. But for a child, it can feel confusing. Rules change depending on who is watching. Some adults are warm and playful. Others are distant, formal, and expect obedience without explanation. Louis was young, but not unaware. He knew his place in the family, even if he didn't fully understand it. He knew his father was serious, but kind. He knew his mother was a safe place, the one who knelt to his level, who listened when he rambled, who laughed when he was silly and hugged him when he wasn't. And he knew Camilla was not that. That doesn't mean Louis disliked her. Children rarely think in those terms, but they are acutely sensitive to tone, to energy, to how adults make them feel. And something about that interaction in the corridor had tipped him over the edge. It wasn't just one comment. It never is. It was a feeling of being corrected instead of comforted, of being spoken to instead of spoken with, of being treated like a problem to be managed rather than a child to be understood. For days, maybe weeks, Lewis had been under more scrutiny than usual. Events, rehearsals, reminders about proper behavior. Sit still. Don't interrupt. Smile here. Wave there. To adults, these are minor instructions. To a young child, they can feel relentless. And then came that moment, the raised voice, the sharp words, the sense that he was being scolded not because he'd done something wrong, but because he'd failed to meet an expectation he didn't even know existed. That's when children break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. You're not my mother. Those words weren't meant to wound. They were meant to protect. Back in quieter room, away from stone corridors and echoing footsteps, Lewis finally let his guard down. He sat on a cushioned chair, feet not quite touching the floor, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The aide stayed close but didn't push. Experience had taught her that children speak when they're ready. After a long pause, Lewis asked a question that stopped her cold. Did I do something bad? There it was, the fear underneath the anger. The aide reassured him gently. No, he hadn't done anything bad. No, he wasn't in trouble. Yes, his mom would be with him soon. She watched as his shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if those words had loosened a knot he didn't know how to untie himself. Children often assume responsibility for adult emotions. If someone is angry, they believe it must be their fault. Lewis was no different. What made this moment especially delicate was who he was. Prince Louis was not just any child. Every expression, every reaction, every outburst, no matter how private, had potential weight. He was learning, even now, that his feelings were something to be managed carefully, that being himself sometimes caused ripples. That's a heavy lesson for someone so young. When Kate finally arrived, everything changed. She didn't rush him with questions or accusations. She knelt in front of Louis, bringing herself eye level, just as she always did. She brushed his hair back gently and waited. No pressure, no rush. Louis leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her neck. That was all the confirmation she needed. Kate listened as the aide quietly explained what happened. She didn't interrupt. Her face remained composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Mothers recognize these moments instantly, the ones that may look small on paper but leave deep marks. Kate turned back to Louis. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked softly. Louis hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet, and Kate respected that. That choice, to wait, to let him speak when he felt safe, was the opposite of what had triggered the confrontation in the first place. It was patience instead of pressure, trust instead of authority. Later that evening, when the palace had settled and routines resumed, Louis finally spoke. His words were simple, childlike, honest. She was shouting. I didn't like it. Kate listened without reacting, without correcting, without minimizing. And that mattered, because moments like these shape children. They teach them whether their feelings are valid, whether their voices matter, whether standing up for themselves is wrong or brave. For Prince Louis, that corridor confrontation would fade with time, but the lesson would not. Somewhere deep inside, a line had been drawn, a boundary, instinctive and clear. And Kate knew something else too. This wasn't just about Louis. If a child felt small enough to lash out like that, then something in the environment had shifted. And that shift needed to be addressed, not loudly, not publicly, but firmly. Elsewhere in the palace, conversations were beginning, quiet ones, careful ones. And at the center of it all was a question no one wanted to ask out loud yet. How did things reach this point? Because once a child speaks a truth like that, it cannot be unheard. By the time the palace returned to its familiar rhythm, the guard was back at his post, still, composed, outwardly unchanged. That was the job. Guards were trained to absorb moments and let them pass through without leaving a trace. No opinions, no reactions, no stories. But some moments don't pass. They settle, This one had. He had served for years, long enough to know the difference between routine tension and something that cut deeper. He'd witnessed political arguments whisper behind doors, emotional reunions after long absences, even a quiet grief that lingers in old buildings like this. Yet a child standing his ground in a corridor had shaken him more than any of it, because it wasn't supposed to happen. Royal children were shielded from conflict as much as possible, not because the family was perfect, but because the image of calm continuity mattered. Stability was the unspoken promise. And when that promise cracked, even slightly, it demanded attention. The guard replayed the scene again and again in his mind, not out of curiosity, but responsibility. He asked himself the same questions repeatedly. Had he misread the tone? Had the child misunderstood? Had the moment been shorter than it felt? But the memory didn't blur with time. It sharpened. He remembered the way Prince Louis's voice changed, not loud but firm. He remembered Camilla's expression before she noticed him. And he remembered his own instinctive step forward, the one he hadn't even consciously decided to take. That step mattered. Inside the palace, nothing is truly informal. Even silence can be interpreted as a choice. And the guard knew that by witnessing the exchange, he had become part of it, whether he wanted to or not. Later that evening, he was quietly summoned by a superior. No urgency, no alarm, just a request to clarify an observation. That phrase alone told him everything. They knew. He was led into a modest office, far from ceremonial rooms. No portraits, no press, just two senior officials seated at a plain table, the kind of setting designed to make conversations feel smaller than they were. He was asked to recount exactly what he had seen and heard. No embellishment, no assumptions. The guard spoke carefully. He described the raised voice, the child's response, the moment of tension. He avoided emotional language, sticking to facts as he had been trained to do. But even stripped of feeling, the account carried weight. Children rarely confront authority directly. When they do, it's usually because they feel cornered. One of the officials nodded slowly as he spoke. The other took notes but said nothing. When the guard finished, there was a pause, long enough to feel deliberate. "You did the right thing," the official finally said. That reassurance didn't bring relief, because doing the right thing in the royal world often came with consequences. The guard left the office knowing something had been set in motion, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, in a way that truly matters inside the palace. Over the next few days, he noticed subtle changes. Certain routes were adjusted. Schedules shifted slightly. Interactions that once felt casual became more structured. And most telling of all, Prince Louis was rarely out of sight of his parents or his primary carers. Protection had tightened, not in response to a threat from outside, but to something within. The guard found himself watching more closely than before, not out of suspicion, but concern. He noticed how differently children responded to different adults, how easily laughter returned when tension was removed, how quickly a warm tone could undo hours of stress. It made him think about power, not the kind written into law or protocol, but the quiet power adults hold over children simply by how they speak to them. And it made him think about lines, because the moment Camilla had raised her voice, a line had been tested. And when Louis pushed back, another line had been drawn. The guard didn't see Camilla again for several days. When he did, she was composed as ever, polite, distant. Nothing in her demeanor suggested disruption, but something had changed in how people interacted around her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the guard noticed. He also noticed the way Prince William carried himself after that day, slightly more alert, more present, less willing to delegate moments involving his children. And Kate, always observant, seemed even more intentional, even more protective, without ever appearing defensive. They didn't make a scene. They didn't need to. In the royal family, silence is often the loudest response. The guard understood his role now more clearly than ever. He wasn't just there to protect physical safety. He was there to preserve boundaries, to be a witness when lines were crossed, to step forward, not always physically, but ethically, when something felt wrong. And that knowledge stayed with him. Because one day, years from now, people might look back and wonder when certain relationships shifted, when access changed, when trust quietly tightened its grip. They would never point to this corridor, or this afternoon, or this guard. But he would remember. He would remember the moment a child spoke a truth that no one could ignore. And he would remember that sometimes the most powerful acts of protection are not dramatic rescues, but simple presence, standing there, listening, and refusing to pretend you heard nothing. Prince William was used to bad news arriving quietly, not with shouting, not with accusations, but with carefully chosen words delivered behind closed doors, wrapped in phrases like a minor concern or an isolated moment. Royal problems rarely announce themselves. They slipped in politely and waited to be acknowledged. This one arrived the same way. William was reviewing briefing notes when a senior aide requested a private word. The tone was neutral, but the timing wasn't accidental. Matters involving children were never delayed. Kate was asked to join them. That alone told her everything. They sat together in a small sitting room, informal by palace standards. No advisors hovering, no phones, just two parents and an aide who looked uncomfortably aware that what he was about to say mattered far beyond protocol. He recounted the incident carefully. No drama, no speculation, just facts. A raised voice, a distressed child, a guard's intervention. William didn't interrupt. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the details unfolded. Kate's hands remained folded in her lap, but her gaze sharpened with every sentence. Parents know when a line has been crossed, even when others try to soften it. When the aide finished, the room fell quiet. William exhaled slowly. Where was Louis afterward? He asked. With the princess, the aide replied. He's fine now. Fine. The words sat uneasily between them. Kate spoke next, her voice calm but firm. This wasn't about discipline, was it? The aide hesitated. Just a fraction. No, he said. It doesn't appear so. That hesitation confirmed what Kate already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a child misbehaving. It was a moment where authority had overreached, and a child had felt it deeply enough to push back. William stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the palace grounds looked serene, almost deceptive in their stillness. This cannot happen again, he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. Kate joined him, placing a hand on his arm, not to calm him, but to steady the moment. William wasn't angry in the explosive sense. He was something far more dangerous in royal terms. He was resolved. They didn't call Camilla in immediately. That choice was deliberate. Emotional conversations held too soon often do more harm than good. Instead, William and Kate focused on Louis. That evening was different. Dinner was quieter, more intentional. No distractions, no rehearsals, no reminders about tomorrow's schedule. Just family. Kate watched Louis closely, not anxiously, but attentively. She noticed how he leaned closer than usual, how he checked her reaction before speaking. Children do that when trust has been shaken. Afterward, William sat with Louis alone. No titles, no lessons, just father and son. Did something happen that made you upset? William asked. Louis nodded. Did you feel like you weren't being listened to? Another nod. William paused, choosing his words with care. You're allowed to speak up when something doesn't feel right. That mattered, because children in royal families are often taught the opposite. That silence is safer, that compliance is expected. William had grown up with that lesson himself, and he knew its cost. Kate listened from nearby, heart heavy but steady. This was the kind of parenting moment that doesn't make headlines, but shapes futures. Later that night, once Louis was asleep, William and Kate spoke privately. This time, there were no aides, no filters. Kate didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This isn't about family politics, she said. This is about how our children are treated. William nodded. I won't have him feeling powerless. They agreed on a plan, not written, not announced, but understood. Access would change. Not dramatically, not publicly. But clearly, interactions involving the children would be more structured, boundaries would be reinforced, and most importantly, any concerns, no matter how small, would be addressed immediately. The next day, William requested a meeting. Camilla arrived composed, as always, pleasant, professional, no hint of defensiveness, at least not outwardly. The conversation was private, no record, no leaks. But those who knew William well understood that when he spoke quietly, it meant the issue was not negotiable. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He simply stated what had occurred and what would not be acceptable going forward. Kate spoke too, not as a princess. As a mother, she didn't question intent. She focused on impact. A child felt frightened, she said evenly. That matters. Camilla listened. She responded calmly, offering explanations, perhaps even justifications. But something in the dynamic had shifted. This was no longer about hierarchy. It was about protection. The meeting ended politely, cordially, even. But when Camilla left the room, she understood something had changed. The door had not closed, but it had narrowed. In the days that followed, the palace carried on as usual. Public appearances were unaffected. Smiles remained intact. The machinery of monarchy moved smoothly. But behind the scenes, a quiet recalibration was underway. William and Kate had drawn a line, not in anger, but in clarity. And once such a line is drawn, it rarely fades. Because in royal families, as in all families, the moments that matter most are not the ones caught on camera. They're the ones where parents decide, silently, firmly, that their children come first. Nothing in the palace changed overnight, and that was exactly the point. There were no announcements, no dramatic reshuffles, no visible rifts for the public to dissect. From the outside, the royal family continued as it always had. Engagements carried out with precision, photographs released on schedule, smiles carefully measured. But inside the walls, something subtle had shifted. And in royal life, subtle shifts are often the most permanent. Prince Louis returned to his usual self quickly, laughter resurfacing, energy restored, mischief making its quiet comeback. To most observers, the incident might have seemed forgotten. Children are resilient like that. They bounce back faster than adults expect. But resilience does not mean erasure. It means adaptation. Louis had learned something important that day. His voice mattered, not because he was a prince, but because he was heard. That lesson, once learned, doesn't disappear. Kate noticed it first. Louis spoke more openly, not rebelliously, but honestly. When he didn't like something, he said so. When something confused him, he asked questions. And when he felt uncomfortable, he looked to his parents without hesitation. That was no accident. Kate had quietly reinforced a safe rule in their home. You don't get in trouble for telling the truth. William supported it fully. He, more than most, understood what happened when children were taught to swallow discomfort for the sake of appearances. He had lived it, and he was determined his children would not inherit the same silence. Elsewhere in the palace, staff adjusted, not because they were instructed to, but because they sensed a change. Interactions involving the children became warmer, more deliberate. Voices softened. Corrections were explained instead of imposed. The message had traveled, without ever being formally spoken. This was a line. Camilla, for her part, remained publicly gracious. Nothing about her role or presence shifted in a way anyone outside the palace would notice. But access is not just about proximity. It's about permission. And permission had been redefined. Conversations involving the children were more often mediated. Private moments became less frequent, not out of punishment, but precaution. It wasn't exclusion. It was protection. Those close to the situation understood this wasn't about one afternoon or one argument. It was about patterns, about how power was used, about the responsibility adults carry when speaking to children, especially children growing up under constant scrutiny. The guard who had witnessed it all noticed a difference too. He saw in the way Prince Louis walked now, more confident, less hesitant, in the way William scanned rooms instinctively, always aware of where his children were, in the way Kate positioned herself, not possessively, but purposefully, close enough to reassure, far enough to let them grow. He never spoke of the incident again. He didn't need to. In the royal world, the absence of repetition is often the clearest sign a lesson has been learned. Over time, the incident faded into palace memory, not as a scandal, but as a quiet correction, a moment when something could have gone one way, but didn't, and that mattered, because history isn't always shaped by grand speeches or public confrontations. Sometimes it's shaped by a child's honest words in an empty corridor, and the adults who choose to listen. "You're not my mother." It wasn't disrespect. It was truth, and truth, especially when spoken by children, has a way of cutting through layers of protocol and pretense. Years from now, no one will remember the exact day or time. There will be no archive footage, no official acknowledgement, but the impact will remain in the way these children grow up knowing their boundaries are respected, in the way authority learns to adjust rather than dominate, in the way the future of the monarchy becomes quietly, deliberately more human. That's how change really happens inside old institutions, not with noise, but with moments, and the courage to listen when they arrive. Crown Scroll and the best royal story scroll crown.